The 20th century is hardly behind us, but already its quarrels and its dogmas, its ideals and its fears are slipping into the obscurity of mismemory. Incessantly invoked as lessons, they are in reality ignored and untaught. This is not altogether surprising. The recent past is the hardest to know and understand. Moreover, the world has undergone a remarkable transformation since 1989, and such transformations always bring a sense of distance and displacement for those who remember how things were before. In the decades following the French Revolution, the douceur de vivre of the vanished Ancien Régime was much regretted by older commentators. 100 years later, evocations and memoirs of pre-World War I Europe typically depicted, and still depict, a lost civilization, a world whose illusions had quite literally been blown apart. Never such innocence again. But there is a difference. Contemporaries might have regretted the world before the French Revolution, or the lost cultural and political landscape of Europe before August 1914. But they had not forgotten them. Far from it. For much of the 19th century, Europeans were obsessed with the causes and meaning of the French revolutionary transformations. The political and philosophical debates of the Enlightenment were not consumed in the fires of revolution. On the contrary, the French Revolution and its consequences were widely attributed to that same Enlightenment, which thus emerged for friend and foe alike as the acknowledged source of the political dogmas and social programs of the century that followed. In a similar vein, while everyone after 1918 agreed that things would never be the same again, the particular shape that a post-war world should take was everywhere conceived and contested in the long shadow of 19th century experience and thought. Neoclassical economics, liberalism, Marxism, and its communist stepchild, revolution, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, imperialism and industrialism, in short, the building blocks of the 20th century political world, were all 19th century artifacts. Even those who, along with Virginia Woolf, believed that in or about December 1910 human character changed, that the cultural upheaval of Europe's fin de siècle had radically shifted the terms of intellectual exchange, nonetheless devoted a surprising amount of energy to shadowboxing with their predecessors. The past hung heavy across the present. Today, in contrast, we wear the last century rather lightly. To be sure, we have memorialized it everywhere: museums, shrines, inscriptions, heritage sites, even historical theme parks are all public reminders of the past. But there is a strikingly selective quality to the 20th century that we have chosen to commemorate. The overwhelming majority of places of official 20th century memory are either avowedly nostalgio-triumphalist, praising famous men and celebrating famous victories, or else, and increasingly, opportunities for the acknowledgement and recollection of selective suffering. In the latter case, they are typically the occasion for the teaching of a certain sort of political lesson, about things that were done and should never be forgotten, about mistakes that were made and should not be made again. The 20th century is thus on the path to becoming a moral memory palace, a pedagogically serviceable chamber of historical horrors, whose way stations are labelled Munich or Pearl Harbor, Auschwitz or Gulag, Armenia or Bosnia or Rwanda, with 9/11 as a sort of supererogatory coda, a bloody postscript for those who would forget the lessons of the century or who never properly learned them. The problem with this lapidary representation of the last century as a uniquely horrible time from which we have now thankfully emerged is not the description. The 20th century was, in many ways, a truly awful era, an age of brutality and mass suffering, perhaps unequalled in the historical record. The problem is the message. That all of that is now behind us, that its meaning is clear, and that we may now advance, unencumbered by past errors, into a different and better era. But such official commemoration, however